All right. I wanted to show you guys this video on where the U.S. aid to Ukraine is actually going from task and purpose. What U.S. aid to Ukraine is actually doing. Hey, how come all those guys have Azov patches?
Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine first began, the United States has now agreed to send $54 billion in assistance, which has left many people to wonder, for that amount, shouldn't the Ukrainian armed forces have already won and had a little left over to buy a Bugatti? But when you look closely at the detailed breakdown of those funds, we can see that the goal of the aid might not be to help Ukraine launch a counterattack and reverse Russia's advance.
What is the American aid to Ukraine really meant to achieve?
Right off the bat, there's $9 billion in it that's set aside for the United States for itself in order to replenish items, weapons, munitions that are sent to Ukraine in the past or future. That's kind of like me giving my friend a check, but writing my own name in the pay to line. Another $8.1 billion of the money is earmarked for, you guessed it again, the US military intelligence services to provide information to Ukraine, and it also maintains a new deployment of 10,500.
Oh, that's for the CIA to operate in Ukraine? Oh, interesting. So it's a proxy war directly, as he rightly points out.
US troops in nearby European countries as a deterrent against Russia, which is kind of like that time I gave myself a gift at my friend's birthday party. Two things that, don't get me wrong, are absolutely important and vital, but will do little to affect the day-to-day life of your average Ukrainian soldier who's fighting in the trenches at this moment. $8.8 billion is directed towards propping up Ukraine's economy, and another $8 billion is for humanitarian aid, including food. It's necessary because Ukraine's economy will shrink by 45%.
Hell yeah, pay me to throw. Thanks, buddy.
This year due to the war, and their country cannot continue to fight if their economy collapses in the background. But it's not going to turn the tide in the war.
Another $4 billion will help Ukraine purchase weapon systems from US defense companies like Raytheon and Lockheed Martin.
Wait a second, is this an aid package for Ukraine or the US military?
The problem is this equipment will take months or even years to reach the front lines.
But already we see $30 billion total dollars here from that $53 billion so far. Has nothing to do with military weapons or vehicles that can help Ukraine decisively win. The fact that much of the free world even agreed to get together to cooperate on sending aid to Ukraine is something of a miracle. It's actually somewhat restored my faith in humanity, but I still think I need to take a critical look at what we could possibly do better here. So then what type of aid does Ukraine say they actually need? According to Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Vladimir Karpenko, international assistance only covers 15% of their total needs. He said, quote, "We need infantry fighting vehicles, combat vehicles, tanks. Those are the assets necessary for any successful counterattack." But curiously, they are largely missing from the list of foreign aid equipment provided to Ukraine. And I don't think that's by mistake. John Kirby at the Pentagon didn't just forget to include an M1 Abrams and an M2 Bradley fighting vehicle in that list. Further evidence of the US defensive strategy comes from studying the list of weapons delivered. So they're sending 200 of the ancient 1960s era M113 armored personnel carriers.
Since it has no turret or cannon, it limits its use as an offensive weapon.
These do not have any serious firepower, and they're essentially the equivalent of a 2002 Toyota Camry of armored vehicles. Sending the M113 actually saves costs for the United States because it's cheaper to give them away to Ukraine instead of continuing to be stuck maintaining the dinosaur equipment that was already scheduled for replacement this year. Only 12 of the HIMARS rocket artillery was sent, along with limited range munitions. Take a look at what the Ukrainian Minister of Defense Oleksiy Reznikov had to say about that.
We and our allies have been rather stingy with such systems. How many more do you need? How many more HIMARS do you need?
For an effective counteroffensive, we would need at least 100, I think. So we need armored vehicles to begin a counteroffensive.
We're at another pivotal moment in the fight, and the foreign...
And by the way, this is important too. The reason why I'm showing you this is because there's no shot that Ukraine is going to be able to do it. Because even if we just gave them everything they say they need, they don't have the logistic capability. They can't do it. They can't support it. They can't maintain it. They can't manufacture it. They can't purchase it. We would basically have to send in the US Army. They don't have the capability. They don't have the training. They don't have the facilities. It would be fucking pointless. It's undoable. So they're not gonna mount a counteroffensive. It's not happening. And the idea that we couldn't give them enough to win. It's just not possible.
That's praxis.
Because the more we escalate our aid to Ukraine, the more the Russians will escalate their economic warfare on the rest of Europe. And Europe is already facing the possibility of having to turn off their electrical grid in the winter. You want to see the world economy collapse? Keep fucking around. So what are we doing? We're killing as many Russians as we can, and we're using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder to do it. We are making money for the military-industrial complex. We are getting bonuses for the Raytheon executives. We got rid of Afghanistan as a black hole to dump billions and trillions of dollars. Now we have Ukraine.
Aid sent so far is clearly not designed to support this new offensive in Kherson. The most recent ISW report said, quote,
Ukraine's preparations for the counteroffensive in Kherson,
combined with the dramatic weakening of the Russian forces generally, appear to be allowing Ukraine to begin actively shaping the course of the war for the first time.
One, Putin is focused on taking Donbass. That's where all his energies are. And two, the Ukrainians are focused on taking a city called Kherson.
The counteroffensive is underway. They're cutting the bridges off and seal off Kherson.
According to daily losses, trends, and knowledge of the amount of total military equipment prior to invasion, it looks like Ukraine has about 631 tanks remaining. They might only have 100 soldiers who are qualified to man those tanks. Here we see some rare footage of what might be some of the last Ukrainian tanks still operating in the vicinity of Kherson. To tell the other side of the story, we need to look at this recently released footage from Russian attack helicopters as they destroy some of Ukraine's last remaining tanks. We also see the Russian Air Forces still providing close air support for the Russian T-72 tanks in the area. They've had the last 2 months to dig in and prepare for this battle.
That's when it finally hit me. This money isn't meant to help Ukraine push the Russians back and win. No, it's specifically designed to stop them from losing. You can understand why they wouldn't want Ukraine to have too much success and back Putin into a corner. The plan is to halt the Russian advance where it is and prevent any further offensive maneuvers. So far, foreign aid has not been powerful enough to prevent Russian forces from capturing the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk at the end of June. Russian forces with vastly superior artillery firepower, outnumbering Ukraine by 8-1, were able to score recent victories in eastern part of the country. Now Russia is moving to assault in the direction of Bakhmut by shelling military and civilian infrastructures in the city. Open source military intelligence reports from the ISW indicate Ukrainian forces have fallen back from their frontline positions to this area here, where they've consolidated their forces to mount a defense. The strategy that Ukrainians have been using for the past 2 months has been to maintain a reserve force here where they can...
This really reminds me of the Ukrainian military's defense is very similar to what the Eastern Front looked like in World War II, which is trying to have, grind as many troops down, inflict as many casualties as possible, but the reality of the war is that it's an inevitable ticking of the clock. You basically have to watch while thousands of people are ground through. It's inevitable. Russia-Ukraine war is as good as over. All Ukraine can do is hold them off. A war of attrition. Basically, Ukraine doesn't have the supplies for a war of attrition. I mean, guess we'll find out.
Easily send units to reinforce whichever direction that the Russian forces choose to assault from. So if there's a push from Izium, they're able to send their forces up there, and if there's a push from Bakhmut, they're able to push their forces there. But after this recent push, both sides seem to be scraping the bottom of the barrel when it comes to what equipment they have left. Here are the 3 reasons that I think are really affecting this decision. First, there is admittedly a history of failure here for the US. In 2008, Iraq purchased 140 of the M1 Abrams tanks, but many of them were quickly captured by the Islamic State, which forced the US warplanes to have to target those formerly friendly Abrams tanks in airstrikes. Second, there would be no...
That's double victory for the military-industrial complex. You gotta buy a new tank, and we got to pay for the bomb, too! W! Also, guess what? We can't afford to provide you with dental care.
Way to deploy civilian General Dynamics engineers that would be required to repair and maintain the M1 Abrams in country. Third,
because the M1 Abrams is ridiculous. It has a turbine engine. Fucking worthless. Incredible.
If Ukraine launches a counterattack that is too successful, at this point it would increase the likelihood of war escalating beyond Ukraine, which would be a loss for the US strategy. Putin has successfully scared the West into believing his nuclear threats.
There is increasing pressure on Mr. Putin. He has raised the stakes, particularly by putting his deterrent forces, nuclear forces, on high alert.
You know, Vladimir Putin putting his nuclear forces on high alert doesn't sound good.
You know what, Mr. Putin? I'll call that bluff. I'm all in. Let's send the weapons. And this is exactly why I was never put in charge of anything. But there is another problem with sending this type of equipment. We've talked a lot about corruption's detrimental effects on the Russian military, but it's also a major concern for Ukraine that no one wants to talk about.
Oh, wait a minute. Ukraine is just as corrupt, or if not more, than Russia? Who knew? Ukraine is the 122nd most corrupt country in the world. The leftists are always good at criticizing this. They don't typically put the Ukraine flag in their name and go anarcho-NATOism.
According to Transparency International, the 2021 Corruption Perception Index, Ukraine ranked 122nd out of 180 countries, making it the second most corrupt in Europe. This is possibly made worse by President Zelensky recently firing his security service chief, Ivan.
By the way, so when we say corruption, we mean corruption that's formally illegal on the books, like just stealing government money. You know, like money that was supposed to be spent on, like, say, a sewer system, you just put in your bank account. Not like lobbying for your campaign donations or hiring your fail son for a no-show job. That's corrupt. But this is like stealing the money that's supposed to go to kids, you know, baby formula and putting it into a Swiss bank account. That's how bad they are. It's selling the ammunition for your infantry unit on the black market.
Benakov and Erevia Venepiov, the prosecutor general, on July 18th for treason. That's the very position responsible for finding and prosecuting internal corruption. People are worried Zelensky is placing yes men in these positions. Many people do not know that before the Russian invasion, Ukraine's efforts to stop corruption had stalled, causing Zelensky's approval rating to drop to 31%. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz explained the situation with, quote, "Just because you're attacked doesn't automatically mean your rule of law improves." All of this is to say, while I believe better systems and more money are necessary to help Ukraine, we also have to acknowledge that the United States throwing more money and weapons at the problem might not have the intended outcome. So when is the war likely to end, and would sending more equipment really make a difference at this point? Well, predictive analytics might help shed some light on the answer. Zos Lazar, defense industry analyst at Medium, created an interactive graph that charts both the Russian and Ukrainian equipment losses in real time. The chart was programmed to determine the point at which attrition will lead to a potential collapse for both sides. The graph automatically updates each day by pulling the latest casualty estimates from open source military intelligence resources, using the daily losses, trends, and knowledge of the amount of military equipment prior to the invasion, and applying linear.
The problem with these kind of open source intelligence analyses is that there's a bias in the input of the data. This isn't an objective data input. It's going to be highly fucking biased in favor of Ukraine because Russian losses will be easy to post. But if you show Ukrainian losses, you get banned. You get suppressed. So reports of Ukrainian losses are suppressed. Reports of Russian losses are amplified. So these kind of predictive, if you depend upon open source intelligence, it's going to be garbage in. So you're garbage out.
Russian analytics, he generated the following numbers.
At this rate, Russian forces would lose 50% of their tanks by November 20th, 2022, setting the conditions for a possible collapse of their forces.
And 25% of their attack aircraft by January 2023. Ukraine is on track to lose 50% of their entire inventory of 858 tanks by the new year, January 2023, and 90% of their attack aircraft by that date as well. This forecast function is obviously far from perfect, but it suggests each side's military is close to being unable to carry out offensive operations. I'll include a link to this interactive graph in the description so you can play around with those numbers.
Well, Ukraine
too,
is already at that point.
The predictions are in line with the report on June 17th from Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister, Vladimir Karpenko, who said in an interview with National Defense, quote, "Today we have about 30, 40, and sometimes up to 50% of the loss of equipment as a result of active battles. Thus, we have lost about 50%. About 1,300 infantry fighting vehicles, 400 tanks, 700 artillery systems have been lost." You can see Ukrainian armed forces are in desperate need of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. On the other side of the equation, the CIA director recently estimated 60,000 Russian soldiers as casualties.
The thing is, like, Russia has its own military industry. Ukraine is relying on imports. They're way less able to sustain than the Russians are. The Russians have a military industry. They don't. It's just that simple. The advance has pretty much devolved into trench warfare. The Russians have artillery superiority. That as well. I mean, this may sound bad, but if Russia invades Ukraine and there's no Western interference, wouldn't that have been less Ukrainian deaths because they would have had to surrender sooner? It's impossible to say. I don't tend to think that you should reward an aggressor, but I do think that we're getting to the point of, like, what there is no alternative. Just throwing Ukrainians under the bus to die, and China and Russia's geopolitical situation improves every day. It's Europe and the United States' position that's becoming untenable, not Russia. Russia's fine. It'll take Russia years to restock. Well, they're going to build up their capability. They're going to invest. They've increased and broadened ties with China. They're increasing and broadening ties with India. They're creating alternatives for their sourcing of material. Russia is a vassal state for a new Chinese superpower. I mean, they're like, yeah, they'll end up in the same position that Germany or the UK is in relation to the US. China is on the brink of economic collapse, dude. Yikes. China is not the United States. It's not going to fall apart because of real estate. That's complete cope. That's complete cope. China will just take the housing, force certain capitalists to lose money, and then execute some billionaires. What, are the houses all going to fall apart tomorrow? They'll just print. They have a massive trade surplus. They have a massive foreign account surplus. They have a massive they have every positive economic indicator you can have. They have. It's just totally delusional and wrong. Anyway, going on.
If Russia turns to external sources like Iran or China to replace these battlefield losses, it would further lower their reputation as a global military power. And that's actually a hint at what this $53 billion of aid and intelligence information given to the Ukrainian military and all of the economic sanctions leveled against Russia are meant to achieve. It all amounts to the United States.
The YouTube algorithm has been pushing a YouTube channel with like 1 million subs, which puts out video daily saying it's about to collapse. Expect to hear those DB takes more often. Yeah, I'm not surprised. Winnebago Warrior, thank you for the tier 1. Appreciate you.
Government showing that they can project power 6,000 miles away to the borders of Ukraine and influence the outcome of the war in their own favor. I believe it's all in the service of diminishing Russia's overall reputation and world standing. If this sounds eerily familiar, it should. During the United States war in Vietnam, both China and the Soviet Union gave weapons, intelligence, strategic advice, and financial loans to Vietnam in order to keep them afloat and bog the United States down in a long, costly war. It was later revealed that the Soviet soldiers even shot down American fighter jets in Vietnam. The US failure to achieve
Cope! That's a right-wing cope. It's popular in military circles to be like, oh, it was actually Russians that were shooting us down because the US lost so many aircraft and were defeated in 1-to-1 head-to-head like dogfights and shit. So they had to be like, no, we're losing to Russians, not Vietnamese. We're losing to Russians. Cope. How many Russians did the US military capture? How many Russian pilots were captured in Vietnam? Must have been hundreds, right?
Their goals in Vietnam arguably diminished their reputation and world standing for a period of time. This tells us the goal of the United States aid to Ukraine could be carefully crafted to draw Russia into a costly quagmire.
But the real reason America is sending all of this aid might have to do with rules. President Biden kind of gave it away in his March 26 remarks about the conflict.
A battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force. Okay, so it sounds like these weapons, the equipment, and the aid is meant to defend this rules-based order. That's a term we hear thrown around all the time.
A war that violates all international norms and seeks to destabilize our rules-based order.
They want to be on the side of the rules-based order.
Ever feel constrained by the rules-based international order?
What do you mean rules-based order? What rules? They don't tell you what the rules are. Whose rules? They don't tell you whose rules. And what are these rules? Well, it's quite clear the only two rules are, you will do whatever the United States says, and if you don't, we will crush you.
That's right. Whose rules? Why rules? When rules? It sounds like some secret Illuminati meeting that happens twice a year, but what does it really mean, this rules-based order? The rules-based order, or liberal international order, traces its roots to 1944, right at the end of World War II. It was set up by institutions that would consult on the rules and mediate disputes to create prosperity, and to make sure powerful states complied with the agreed-upon rules. These institutions were the United Nations and the IMF and World Bank.
Momentous opening words of the Great Charter for World Peace. 200 men and women of 50 nations labored to build an organization that will outlaw war for all time.
It's governed interactions between nations and has arguably led to an explosion in wealth and reduction in poverty across the world. People forget how remarkable of a human achievement the rules-based order really is.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine sought to overturn the entire rules-based system and create a new world order.
Its target is the whole planet. It is an attempt to establish the new world order. This new world order would be based on a terror.
When we think of it in these terms, there's almost no amount of money the US won't spend to protect this system.
But there's a major problem with this rules-based order. Why is Russia so dead set on attacking this rules-based order? Every system has its winners and its losers. According to Russia, China, and Iran, and many critics, the rules-based order is rigged against certain countries like them from the start, and it's set up to favor and benefit only the architects of this system, namely the United States.
Evidence that Putin hates the rules-based order comes from this quote.
The model of the total domination of the so-called golden billion is unfair. Well, why should this golden billion of the entire population of the planet dominate everyone, impose its own rules of conduct based on the illusion of exclusivity? It is due to the robbery of people both in Asia and Africa. It is unfair, inherently racist, and neo-colonial. So according to Putin here, the US does not need to abide by its own rules. He points to the US invasion of Iraq as proof of this. The golden billion are anyone living in a country who is favored by the rules-based system. Personally, I don't think having a world governed by authoritarian dictator-led countries would produce better results, but it's important for us to understand what the heads of US and Russian governments are trying to achieve here. The American aid to Ukraine is designed to basically be a form of US power projection to achieve the goal of humiliating Russia and providing credibility that the rules-based order still has the power to govern countries around the world.
All right, hold on. I gotta back this up and watch it again.
Is rigged against certain countries like them from the start, and it's set up to favor and benefit only the architects of this system, namely the United States.
Evidence that Putin hates the rules-based order comes from this quote.
You call it rules, but what are the rules? Like, that's the point. It's just it's just American global hegemony. That's it. It's just exploit, get indebted to the Western banks, give us your resources, let us enslave and abuse your people. You better not set up any kind of social services. You better not educate. You better not try to manufacture. Fuck you.
Model of the total domination of the so-called golden billion is unfair. Well, why should this golden billion of the entire population of the planet dominate everyone, impose its own
He's talking about the billion of Japan, South Korea, European Union, United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. That's the golden billion, basically. Those are the people that dominate the rest of the world.
of conduct based on the illusion of exclusivity. It is due to the robbery of people both in Asia and Africa. It is unfair,
and Latin
inherently
America.
racist, and neo-colonial. So according to Putin here, the US does not need to abide by its own rules. He points to the US invasion of Iraq of proof of this. The golden billion are anyone living in a country who is favored by the rules-based system. Personally, I don't think having a world governed by authoritarian dictator-led countries would produce better results, but it's important for us to understand what the heads of US and Russian governments are trying to achieve here. The American aid to Ukraine is designed to basically be a form of US power projection to achieve the goal of humiliating Russia.
The US basically assassinates and kills any democratically elected leftist in the entire world, and then goes, "You don't want to be led by an authoritarian country, do you?"
And providing credibility that the rules-based order still has the power to govern countries around the world. Power projection is defined as the ability of a nation to apply elements of national power, including political, economic, informational, or military, to respond to a crisis and enhance regional stability. It's fancy geopolitical speak for, bro, I can f you up anywhere on this earth. The US is projecting power here by using economic sanctions, sending satellite military intelligence to the Ukrainian armed forces, and pressing every lever available in the international rules-based system, like cutting Russia off from the SWIFT banking system. Some critics believe the US should call Putin's nuclear bluff at this point and send new offensive geared tanks and fighter aircraft, while others believe it would be lost to corruption or fall into the wrong hands like it has in the past in Iraq and Afghanistan. The lesson here, I think, is sometimes even when you're trying to do the right thing, there is no easy answer.
The lesson is that neither the US nor Russia are trying to do the right thing for anyone but themselves. That's correct. That's correct. But there's multiple different ways of doing the right thing. The United States has set up what's known as unequal exchange. Basically, we exploit countries for their natural resources and we don't pay them the fair market value of the products we take.
That's praxis.
All right? Say we mine $1 trillion of oil from Nigeria. We are not going to give Nigeria and their people $1 trillion. We're going to steal that shit. That's the unequal exchange. And then we use IMF loans and we use international order to constrain the Nigerian government so they can't do things like tax the oil companies or build education or build domestic manufacturing or build domestic infrastructure. That's how they remain poor while being so rich, because our domestic order, our international order is set up to extract. Are you watching the stream unsubbed? You're making income inequality worse. You are doing anti-praxis. We are the only Twitch stream that will not accept scam advertisers, and I will never fuck you over by selling you crap.